Tonight's holy word comes from Luke 7, verses 1 through 17. After Jesus had finished all his sayings in the hearing of the people, he entered Capernaum. A centurion there had a slave whom he valued highly, and who was ill and close to death. When he heard about Jesus, he sent some Jewish elders to him, asking him to come and heal his slave. When they came to Jesus, they appealed to him earnestly, saying, "He is worthy of having you do this for him, for he loves our people, and it is he who built our synagogue for us." And Jesus went with them. But when he was not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to say to him, "Lord, do not trouble yourself, for I am not worthy to have you come under my roof. Therefore I did not presume to come to you, but only speak the word, and let my servant be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, with soldiers under me, and I say to one, 'Go,' and he goes, and to another, 'Come,' and he comes, and to my slave, 'Do this,' and the slave does it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed at him, and turning to the crowd that followed him, he said, "I tell you, not even in Israel have I found such faith." When those who had been sent returned to the house, they found the slave in good health. Soon afterwards, he went to a town called Nain, and his disciples and a large crowd went with him. As he approached the gate of the town, a man who had died was being carried out. He was his mother's only son, and she was a widow, and with her was a large crowd from the town. When the Lord saw her, he had compassion for her and said to her, "Do not weep." Then he came forward and touched the bier, and the bearers stood still. And he said, "Young man, I say to you, rise." The dead man sat up and began to speak, and Jesus gave him to his mother. Fear seized all of them, and they glorified God, saying, "A great prophet has risen among us, and God has looked favorably upon his people." The word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Thank you, Calvary, for the invitation and opportunity to provide a meditation on today's narrative lectionary. As I was reading, studying, and praying to prepare for this, I wondered how the juxtaposition of these two stories, the healing of the centurion's servant and the healing of the widow's son, would be meaningful in our reflection together. And I wondered how might Spirit be speaking and teaching us through holding these two stories together, and what threads are weaving through them, and really throughout all of Jesus' interactions in Luke and in the Gospels as a whole. The Gospel of Luke contains more mention of women and the poor than any other gospel, and Luke is filled with ways Jesus shows compassion to others. His earlier declaration of bringing good news to the poor is being made manifest through his actions here. Jesus embodies compassion in these stories, and he will do so in a more literal way too, in the symbolic compassion of Jesus on the cross, which to me is the most meaningful aspect of the crucifixion. That there is a relatable suffering I know Jesus understands through the way he loved and the way he suffered, connected to the ways in which we suffer. Compassion is different from just helping or supporting, and while those things are good, compassion means getting right to the heart and place of another's suffering. Theologian, priest, writer Henry Nouwen defines compassion this way. Compassion means going directly to those people and places where suffering is most acute and building a home there. God's compassion is total, absolute, unconditional, without reservation. Unlike the immediacy of Mark's gospel, Luke's shows Jesus' intentionality that allows a space for sharing pain, which we see clearly in the second story with the Jewish widow. He shares the widow's pain. Sharing that pain, that suffering with, is the very definition of compassion. But there is another theme in these stories, and that is the theme of authority. Some of us cringe when we hear that word, and there is a lack of trust among those in authority, and at times for good reason. But what would it take for us to trust good authority, the compassionate authority of Jesus and those who work to embody it? Sometimes that is difficult to discern, and these stories, I think, help us differentiate between the kind of sanctioned power through structures and the authority of God, which is always from a place of love. And that kind of love should inform and perhaps at times overrule certain agencies of authority. So we have these two stories. The first includes a Roman centurion, a commanding officer in the Roman army. But Jesus meets the needs with compassion. The other, a vulnerable Jewish widow, where Jesus has more cultural authority in his maleness, but he meets her in her grief with compassion. In one, we have this officer who knows his power and he uses it, but there is a recognition of Jesus' kind of loving authority greater than his. And in the other, Jesus meets a need without any request. There are multiple layers of power differential between these two stories, and the centurion can give orders. He has agency. The widow is vulnerable, and in her culture, she has no socioeconomic status now that her son is dead. In a patriarchal culture, she is removed from protection in no longer having a husband or son. In both these stories, Jesus interacts with such a need that is telling us something about compassion's equalizing power. One that through Jesus and in possibility through us provides healing regardless of status, laws, levels of authority, distance or nearness, and many other categories we could identify. I think it's normal to be a bit skeptical of the centurion. I know I am, and I know I'm not the only one. I find myself asking what the centurion's motivations were. Was it monetary? He did use the word value after all. When reading this passage through an American lens, we must take seriously the devastation of U.S. slavery, its ongoing impact, and continue the work of racial justice, while also exegetically in the biblical context, understanding that slavery had different nuances around permanence and status and coming and going among servants in this story. But still, it is Jesus' compassion that is revealed in all of it. And in a careful reading of this text, as much as I want to remain distant from the centurion in my distrust of him, we see that this centurion Gentile demonstrates his own love and compassion for the Jewish leaders in his town, who themselves tell Jesus that he is worthy. He is presented as an honorable man. And Luke uses a rare word for friendship in reference to the centurion's connection with them by using the word philoi. The meaning of the word philoi is deeply rooted in the concept of reciprocity, encompassing the exchange of favors and support, in addition to a profound sense of duty to each other. And I might then wonder how his servant is near and dear to his heart, as he described. Is there a deeper relationship between the two we are unaware of? There is a humility coming from the centurion in the way he recognized Jesus' authority as higher than his. Truth be told, I was a little annoyed when the centurion went on about his authority in verse 8. when he talks about whatever he says his soldiers and servants do. I thought, okay, we all get it. You order people around, wow you. But the Jewish leaders are telling this to Jesus, and Jesus responds with amazement. Maybe that kind of compassion is also evident in the centurion's relationship with the servant and with the Jewish leaders and community. The centurion himself tells Jesus all he needs to do is say the word. And so we see a trust and a humbling of self when he recognizes a power much greater than his. Perhaps we see this centurion becoming more human here, more relatable. We see him sort of metaphorically stripped of his systems of authority to becoming someone completely humanized, no longer dominant, but rather now subservient himself to the ultimate power of love and compassion in Jesus. Jesus is amazed. How often is Jesus amazed, I wonder? Imagine such a reversal among leaders in our world in their authority. Imagine a reversal of our own skepticism of others to one of compassion and empathy. It does indeed take a great faith in order to recognize God's authority over our lives and healing, forgiveness, and the newness we need. But it's not about believing the right things. And it's not about whether great faith or no faith deserves different responses. For Jesus, there is not a requirement for divine healing. There is something greater working through Jesus that goes beyond laws and religious parameters around what's clean and unclean, what is far and what is near, what authority someone has or doesn't have. There is a giving into humility in order to change the power dynamic so that power is not about domination, but compassion. The centurion humbles himself to Jesus in order to ask for help, as Jesus' servant for his own servant. Then in the next story, contextually, Jesus is culturally superior to the widow in his maleness, yet Jesus steps in to the story of the vulnerability of the widow, where she is truly seen by Jesus, bringing her to attention in the eyes of compassion and healing. And isn't it a wonder to see how Jesus and these other characters in the Bible are all part of an influential humility and compassion? They are all linked to each other, and once Jesus' compassion enters, that becomes what matters. That kind of revealing in Jesus brings both comfort and an invitation to practice compassion in ways that will transform us and our communities. We are called upon to embody compassion, and in doing so, we are partnering with God to transform our world. We are being invited to the level plane by Jesus, the great leveler, of an equalizing compassion. I love the way Jesus just intuits the need for compassion without anybody petitioning for it in the story of the widow. He simply meets a need. Do we do that, especially when we have certain culturally given authority? And in the case of the centurion, perhaps we are invited to ask ourselves what authority and privilege we might have to make access to care and resources universal and equitable. As a hospital chaplain, I have witnessed the ways in which this pandemic has no discrimination when it comes to any category or identity. Health issues are levelers. We are all vulnerable to health crises. We have all seen how it impacts celebrities and people in prominent positions, as well as our neighbors and the people who we are in personal relationships with. We do, however, need to be aware of the difference in accessibility to care. While COVID can impact anyone, not everyone has equal access to protection and adequate health care. Our nation is not a place of full equity when it comes to resources for dealing with health crises. This pandemic has opened wide those realities. My hope is that this is one thing we can learn. from going through this pandemic. Journalist Patrice Peck, founder of the newsletter Coronavirus News for Black Folks, shared in an article entitled, "The Virus is Showing Black People What They Knew All Along." The subtitle reads, "COVID-19 doesn't discriminate by race, yet it has still laid bare the brutality of racism in the United States." She goes on to point out that everyone in the U.S. is at the mercy of the coronavirus. It doesn't discriminate by race or class or gender or age, and yet from the very beginning of the pandemic, the virus has exposed and targeted all of the disparities that come along with being Black in America. She says, "We are dying at 1.7 times the rate of white people from this virus, which means that the toll of these disparities has never been easier to quantify. 19,000 Black people would still be alive if not for systemic racism." Jesus steps into both stories, where on the one hand the centurion, regardless of his status, has no control to order his servant to heal. So even with all of his privilege and authority, he asks for help. And on the other hand, it is paired with the other story where the widow who has lost everything is simply approached by Jesus' own keen awareness of her grief and suffering. What would a compassion such as this mean for an equitable society? Earlier I mentioned that we are being invited to the level plain by Jesus. In chapter 6, we read about the Sermon on the Plain. It is a leveling, a teaching on a level place, but with a profound call of challenging instruction to love our enemies, to not judge, how trees will reveal, how trees are known by their fruit. And now we see that thread here. There is a leveling in these stories, an equal plane, if you will, upon which compassion has no limits. Grace and healing have no requirements, and it doesn't answer to status or worth. It's as if compassion comes in to eradicate any harmful power dynamics. And maybe we have the power to embrace humility, to show compassion, to acknowledge privilege, to centralize those in need, and to be part of a shifting and changing of dynamics and power in order to serve a greater good. Regardless of my skepticism of the centurion's motivation, compassion wins in the end. Regardless of the dire social status and grief of the widow, compassion wins in the end. And I think it's interesting to note that we will see a centurion again, remember, at the foot of the cross, declaring, "This is the Son of God." And in the story of the widow, we hear Jesus' words, "I say to you, rise." So in these two stories, we also have a foreshadowing of the cross and the resurrection. What is the common thread? Healing and compassion. From the Sermon on the Plain to these healing stories, throughout the gospel to Judea, recall the last verse. This word about him spread throughout Judea and all the surrounding country. So to Judea, the location where Jesus will be crucified, to the cross and the resurrection. What stories do you hear about the cross and resurrection? Has it been a more narrow expectation from you? Has it been an exclusive teaching? Has it been about an attachment to some sort of outcome you get if you believe a certain way? Is it substitutional or relational? Do you think you have to have enough faith in order to be healed? If so, today's passage tells us otherwise. And remember that healing isn't always physical. It is communal, it is relational, it is spiritual. These stories are about how love, healing, and compassion will always have the final say, and that any laws and regulations, statuses, and categories hold no ground in the equalizing compassion of Jesus. Perhaps it's not only about the centurion's faith, but more about his transformation. And perhaps in the second story, it's not only about her son who is healed and raised from the dead, but also the widow who is centralized in the story by Jesus' presence and compassion for her. If Jesus' mission is to bring good news to the poor, she is also a recipient of healing, the restoration of her place among community. In verse 15, we read, Jesus gave him to his mother. There is more to that than just a handing over. And so, what should we take away from that? Among the crowd, Jesus truly sees her. All too often, we do not find ourselves with the marginalized, and we do not see them. While a physical healing does take place in the story, Jesus' compassion is for the woman. What kind of restoration among our community needs to happen for the vulnerable, the marginalized, the ones who are more vulnerable to this pandemic, to political power, in order to be seen? What would it mean to place our faith in the power of a divine compassion made known through Jesus? What would it mean to suffer with each other the same way God suffers with us, as revealed here and on the cross? What would it mean and what would it look like to work together in community, to bring healing, to create space for compassion, to acknowledge brokenness and bring newness of life? You know, a level plane for all of us is not a threat, unless it is a threat to a dominant, life-limiting kind of power. But equity among all is not something to fear. There is an intersectionality in this that we should take seriously. Yes, it means much is being asked of a lot of us. It realizes that any form of oppression should take into account other forms of oppression. And we can see ways in which, on a hierarchy of power, sometimes those people flip the script and act as if they are the victim when confronted with issues of justice and equity. That is a fear-based response, all about losing power. That's what white supremacy does, that's what greed does, that's what the ego does. Civil rights advocate and lawyer Kimberly Williams Crenshaw addresses this kind of rejection and criticism of intersectionality and explains its purpose in stating that, contrary to her critics' objections, intersectionality isn't an effort to create the world in an inverted image of what is now. Rather, she says, the point of intersectionality is to make room for more advocacy and remedial practices to create a more egalitarian system. She goes on to say, intersectionality operates as both the observance and analysis of power imbalances and the tool by which those power imbalances could be eliminated altogether. And the observance of power imbalances, as is so frequently true, is far less controversial than the tool that could eliminate them. Jesus' willingness to be compassionate as God created him to be reveals itself again and again in the good news of the Gospels. And we know the risk. We know where it leads for him. But Jesus' compassion shows us how an eradication of power dynamics and structures that undergird laws and politics and culture can change in ways that allow a level playing field where all our humanity, our need, our vulnerability are equal, and that the ability to practice compassion as Jesus does can bring about healing we all need in more ways than one. May we be willing to be transformed by Jesus' compassion and to be compassion in ways that will transform not only ourselves, but our communities and our world. So be it. Amen.